at MIT, perhaps. We get in touch in Boston? Okay.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let's get going again. If you could take your seats. Thank you. I would like to introduce for our second panel of the morning, we have two presentations. The first is by Professor David Mowery of the Haas School of Business at Berkeley, and he will be talking about the development of U.S. information technology, focusing particularly on computers and semiconductors. David, over to you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm, as Rebecca suggested, I'm the first of a tag team talking about the broad IT sector. And I'm really focusing on these three, what effectively are new industries that come out of the U.S. economy in the post-war period: semiconductors, hardware, and software. And I want to emphasize a couple of points here. First is that these new industries really benefited enormously from federal R&D investments, particularly defense-related R&D investments. But the effects of federal policy on the growth of these industries to accelerate innovation relied on additional policy instruments, particularly in the areas of federal procurement, defense-related procurement, antitrust, and IP policy. And I think this reflects my focus in particular on sort of a broader conceptualization of innovation as it relates particularly to energy technologies, which is, as Ashish Arora mentioned, we need to worry a great deal about the speed with which these technologies can be commercially applied and adopted, in addition to the speed with which they are created. And I think this is an area where federal policy was particularly significant, certainly in semiconductors and hardware, and to a lesser extent in software. The other theme, I think, that comes out, at least the theme that I see in my remarks, is the institutional innovation you see operating in all three of these areas during the post-1945 period. We have universities playing a variety of roles. We have industry playing a variety of roles, and the feds as well, intervening in unusual ways. So I think that has at least some implications potentially for the energy field. The last area where I think the IT story may be more complicated in its implications for energy R&D, particularly for climate change as we sit here today, is that much of what I'm talking about is federal policy at the dawn of these industries, during a period in which federal agencies and federal spending constituted a much greater share of both the R&D spending in these industries and the demand for the products of many of these industries. In the energy field, we face a very, very different situation, and that, I think, has some cautionary implications for the ease with which we draw conclusions from this story for energy R&D. So let me talk about semiconductors first, and then I'll talk about hardware and software, really summarizing kind of the early history of federal policy and innovation. The origins of the transistor really date back to a program of R&D that began in the 30s and expanded considerably during wartime on semiconducting materials that focused particularly on electronics and radar technologies, taken up and expanded by Bell Labs during and after World War II. The Bell Labs research team, headed by William Shockley, however, was very much engaged in a race, a basic science race, really, with university researchers at Purdue. But having beaten the Purdue team, who were federally funded, Signal Corps, U.S. Signal Corps funding, to effectively invent the first transistor. Industry subsequently really takes the lead in developing the technology, and I think one of the greatest illustrations of the gap between industrial and academic research in this field, particularly in applied areas, was the fact that Frederick Terman, then the provost at Stanford University when Shockley Semiconductor was enticed by Terman and others to locate very close to the Stanford campus, sent one of his very junior faculty members, Jim Gibbons, out to Shockley Semiconductor to sort of camp there for a couple of years and learn about semiconductor technology in order to develop sufficient know-how and understanding of the technology to be able to teach semiconductor technology and particularly processing technology. So you have a situation here in which universities were trying to learn from industry, reversing the usual stereotypical progression here. The Bell Labs presence in semiconductor technology, transistor technology, was particularly significant because Bell Labs was the target of a federal antitrust suit that influenced, in many respects, the decisions by Bell Labs to open up its technology portfolio to other industrial and academic actors. Under partly an indirect effect, I think, of the antitrust suit was AT&T's sponsorship of seminars on transistor technology in the early 50s, and much more significant was, as part of the settlement of the federal antitrust suit, the decision by AT&T both to limit its commercial exploitation in non-telecom markets of transistor technology, to limit its activities as a seller of transistors, and more importantly, to license its very large portfolio of patents. So this really opens up the patent portfolio of the leading industrial practitioner of this technology, and equally importantly, it establishes a tradition, if you will, of extensive cross-licensing of technologies in this industry, because AT&T, in exchange for its licenses, requested a reciprocal cross-license. So you have a great deal of cross-licensing that emerges within this industry. The military became extremely interested in transistor technology for applications in both computers and guidance and navigation systems, and invested substantially in R&D within the industry, initially really investing heavily in production, process technology, but over time moving into trying to support the development of product technologies. Interestingly, however, and again revealing the importance of federal procurement demand, the firms that over time entered the industry accounted for a relatively small share of R&D contracts. However, they grew rapidly to occupy a much more significant role as sellers and to the military and to the defense-related agencies of transistor and related semiconductor components. So you have, again, this issue of the procurement lever in some ways being of great significance to new entrant firms, and in some respects outweighing the early significance of R&D spending. Texas Instruments enters, pursues the development of the integrated circuit in the hopes of gaining a large DoD procurement contract in the late 1950s, primarily for guided missiles. And this, too, is an illustration of one of the direct effects, as well as the lingering and ongoing indirect effects of procurement policy on the industry's development. DoD awarded procurement contracts to relatively new firms supporting entry. In addition, this allowed these entrants to ride the learning curve down, to lower the costs of their products, and to support the adoption of these technologies in non-military applications. As the price went down, their attractiveness for commercial applications in a broader array of industries and products expanded. And importantly, the requirements of DoD procurement contracts, directed as they were to new firms with uncertain production capabilities, DoD required that these firms have, as a backup, a second source for products, so that there was no single firm, particularly a new firm, who was the sole supplier. This, in turn, induced a great deal of exchange of know-how and production technology among firms. So you have, once again, a lot of know-how flowing among firms, not just through cross-licenses, but through the effects of these second source requirements. So, summarizing the semiconductor story and galloping along over an extensive history here, really R&D funding is of great importance, particularly in the early years, but procurement policy, both the magnitude of procurement purchases and the policies that were implemented as part of these procurement buys were also extremely important. Antitrust and procurement policy reduced entry barriers and supported these inter-firm flows of technology. The potentially very strong exclusionary effects, the ability of patent holders to block others from either entry or developing similar products, were to a great extent limited by both the licensing by AT&T of its patent portfolio and the cross-licensing of patents that develops, and AT&T's potential dominance as a commercial producer, as a supplier of components, also was forestalled by the settlement of the US v. AT&T suit. What is interesting as well, I think, is the extent to which this military influence on the evolution of the semiconductor industry declines over time. And I think as military demand declines as a share of overall industry output, and as military R&D declines as a share of industry R&D spending, the clearest illustration of this is the very high-speed integrated circuit program of the 1980s and 90s, which really represented an effort by the Defense Department to sort of get back into and redirect and reattract the interest of commercial producers of semiconductor components in the military market. And in effect, VHSIC spent a considerable amount of $750 million or so on R&D and related procurement, with a view to trying to bring these firms back into a role as major military suppliers, but its effects were quite limited simply because so much of the non-military market and R&D budget had expanded significantly. So the direct federal influence through these historically important levers over the evolution of semiconductor technology and the industry, I think, had declined significantly. Now, computer hardware presents a very interesting contrast in some ways and similarities in others. Like the transistor, like semiconductors, computers really originated in World War II military R&D programs. But interestingly, and in contrast to the situation in semiconductors, universities were initially some of the key players, not just as sources of basic research, but as sources of technology development. Harvard and the University of Pennsylvania were among the pioneering developers of some of the earliest computers, and MIT, through Lincoln Labs, really was the prime contractor, if you will, for what was the first major federal application of computer technology in a defense-related area, the semi-automated ground environment SAGE air defense system, very large system of linked computers that ran a set of radar installations to warn against Soviet bombing raids. So universities begin as major sources of really development as well as basic research. Over time, their role changes as industry comes in as an important player in the development area. Nevertheless, industry is substantially supported through federal R&D, supporting over half of overall computer-related R&D at major firms during the 1950s. DoD and the National Science Foundation, however, also begin to invest heavily in the creation of essentially a human capital and academic research infrastructure. During the 1950s and 1960s, federal agencies make major contributions to academic R&D and also purchase the mainframes that really form the nucleus of many university computer science departments at places like Duke and Stanford and elsewhere. And you see that PhD granting computer science programs grow rapidly in number from a very small number of programs in the mid-1960s to more than 150 by the mid-1990s. Also, the role of the feds and particularly the military agencies as supporters of R&D was not combined with tight restrictions on access to this research. And I think there are a number of examples of efforts by Defense Department program managers to maintain access to these programs by civilian and industrial researchers, as well as academic researchers. You have the seminar at the University of Pennsylvania, and right after the development of the ENIAC computer, sponsored by DoD and opened more or less to all comers. Once again, in the procurement area, procurement playing a very important role in the computer hardware industry, new firms, key players as winners of contracts. Here, too, we have an antitrust suit, the settlement of which in the same year as US v. AT&T also mandated licensing by IBM, a potentially dominant, who became a dominant player, nevertheless mandated licensing and cross-licensing of its computer-related patents. So antitrust plays an important role here, procurement, in addition to the important federal presence as a supplier of R&D funding. Federal procurement buys, the federal presence within the market for computers, as was true of semiconductors, declines over time, although the federal agencies, particularly in agencies such as the National Security Agency, the federal labs involved in nuclear weapons design, remain important customers for very high-end and supercomputers by the 1970s and 1980s. So, summarizing policy here, once again, antitrust policy plays an important role in computers, supporting both competition among firms, entry of new firms, and through particularly the licensing of patents, inter-firm flows of knowledge, R&D spending, motivated largely by national security needs, but nevertheless open to a much greater extent than federal R&D programs in the UK or France, open to civilian researchers, and the creation of this infrastructure largely in universities for training people and conducting fundamental research. Interestingly, procurement, particularly during the 1960s and 70s, federal procurement really discriminated, particularly in non-military areas, against the dominant supplier of hardware, IBM, in a policy that was quite the antithesis of most European government policies toward their domestic computer industries, but nevertheless was a policy that spawned and supported greater inter-firm competition in the hardware area. Software, the third of the triad here, I think is an industry that really emerges from foundations laid by federal policy and industrial investment in the hardware industry. But the development of software as a standalone or a separate technology and industry also is heavily influenced by federal policy. And here, too, you have the creation of a major institution for training very early software developers, neither in universities nor in government, but in what was effectively a think tank. The SAGE program, the software component of which was managed by the RAND Corporation and placed enormous and unprecedented demands on developers of software for what was a very complex software-intensive system. The SAGE program really operates as one of the first trade schools for software developers. Very little capacity in universities, minimal capacity in federal labs, limited capacity in industry. SAGE really becomes an important source of early skills development in this area. Hardware procurement influences the development of other important standardized software languages, including COBOL, which was common business-oriented language, really developed in response to a DoD request in the late 1950s. So what becomes a broad broadly applied standard software language really originates in a DoD procurement demand. And this plays out through the software industry's development as it emerges really as an independent industry in the late 1960s, partly because of discouragement of computer buys from IBM by federal procurement policy. You have the development of computer services firms, particularly in the DC area, serving federal clients during the 1960s, and a very important decision by IBM to separately price its hardware and software products in 1968, undertaken under pressure of an antitrust suit, facilitated entry by independent software developers. In addition, I think the market for software in the U.S. develops in ways that support the growth of an independent industry. You have platforms, standardized platforms broadly applied in a number of applications, developing in both the mainframe and subsequently in the personal computer industry. And particularly in the personal computer era, the rapid adoption, the growth of a very large installed base really creates a, if you will, a petri dish for a phenomenon that our next speaker, Shane Greenstein, has talked about in other contexts, user-driven innovation. You get a lot of users out there experimenting with this new technology, and they in turn spawn a great deal of innovation. I think that is an area where there may be some analogs and implications for energy R&D, and it underscores the importance in some cases of the rapid development of a broad installed base. Intellectual property rights, formal IP in this industry in software remain relatively weak, relatively uncertain because of uncertainty about the patentability of software code, really. Prior to 1980, the same year that life forms were determined by the Supreme Court to be patentable, Diamond v. Deere, another Supreme Court decision, reaches the same conclusion about software, effectively opening the gates and what become floodgates to patenting in software. But prior to this time, you really have a relatively uncertain and weak environment of formal IP rights. Finally, as was the case with semiconductors, you have once again in the 1980s an effort by DoD to come back into the industry as a purchaser and try to influence the direction of technology development. This is the Ada software project, DoD sitting on this enormous pile of software in myriad applications throughout numerous weapon systems and elsewhere, desperately wanted to standardize and simplify its software universe, and attempted to do so by, once again, attracting industry to develop software subject to the parameters, the requirements of a new architecture, Ada, which ultimately turned out to be unsuccessful in large part because the Defense Department simply did not any longer constitute a sufficiently significant portion of demand or development funding. So, a few conclusions here. Again, I think the scale of federal investments in all three of these sectors, but particularly semiconductors and hardware, during the post-war period was very significant, but the structure of these IT-related R&D programs was arguably at least as important. Competition, once again, emerges, I think, as a very strong theme in looking back at this history. Competition among performers of research, competition among commercializers, pluralism, a number of different federal agencies competing, as it were, for budgets, for R&D budgets, and enabling developers to play one agency off against another. Again, a diversified portfolio of results. Also, reliance by federal agencies on extramural performers of research rather than federal laboratories. Federal policy extending beyond R&D and really influencing through a variety of instruments the adoption environment, demand, interfirm technology flows, and the like, and obviously playing an important role in the training of the people who in turn played a critical role. The structure of the procurement, as I said earlier, new firms playing an important role as winners of contracts, and again, effectively these procurement competitions occupying a role not dissimilar from what people view as a prize competition in the energy space. I think also important is the evolving role of intellectual property rights here in all three of these industries for a variety of reasons. During the foundational period, formal intellectual property rights did not play a major exclusionary role, either in limiting entry or in limiting access in many respects to technology by firms in the industries. DoD's influence in all three of these areas also declines over time, and I think that, as I said earlier, is a reason to think twice about borrowing quickly or easily from this history for energy. Last slide, what's different about energy? I think, again, we haven't actually read each other's slides in advance. Nevertheless, I think great minds are working alike here in the sense that demand comes through as a key influence, obviously, in the IT history, and certainly is an area where energy looks different from IT. The demand side, and certainly policy to support stable demand and to price externalities in energy has been at best inconsistent, and I think that has some implications. I think also that there are some challenges in the energy field that arguably these early developers and program managers in IT did not face. First, as was suggested earlier, is the fact that energy, particularly in the adoption area, you really are competing with a very large installed base of mature technologies. And that is an enormously significant contrast. Secondly, by virtue of the fact that these technologies are themselves more mature, government is not likely to be able to play a comparably dominant role as either a purchaser, potentially very important, or as a funder of the research and development. So here, too, I think we're sort of much further along in history in energy than we were in IT, and that has some implications for how we apply such lessons as I've tried to convey from IT for the energy R&D space. Thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions.
Jeff Alexander with SRI. Professor, I'm kind of curious if you could talk a little bit more about the diffusion side of the computer hardware and software story. One part that I don't see emphasized very often, and you make some allusion to, is the role of service providers like systems integrators. And one of the clauses of or provisions of the IBM antitrust suit was that they were prohibited from marketing computer services under their own brand, and that allowed EDS and Anderson Consulting and so on to play a very key role in teaching enterprises how to use information technology more effectively. I was wondering if you could comment a bit on that, and if you see that as having some relevance to this discussion.
Well, yeah, I think it's certainly, if you look at where the software industry came from, many of the people and some of the firms originated as services firms, and that in turn, I think, did reflect to some extent the settlement in the IBM antitrust suit, but also even prior to that, this procurement demand from federal agencies for services, and by and large, these agencies, non-military agencies primarily, being directed not to source from IBM for these services. So both of those created a space, and is one of the reasons that you actually have a historic concentration of services and IT firms in the Washington area, because they were serving this federal procurement market. Mm-hmm.
Dick Van Adder with the Science Technology Policy Institute. Dave, you mentioned the role of TI and others coming in supported by the government, particularly in the production end of the ICs. What's interesting is one of the second sources was Westinghouse, which was essentially a fairly large-scale incumbent that did not actually have the original technologies, and they failed. They just totally failed. And you also have the situation with IBM as a large-scale incumbent in the computer industry. Not reacting to the changes in the marketplace very effectively, allowing for the PCs and other things to enter in. Do you see any possibilities that this could be one of the lessons from the these other industries in terms of dealing with the large-scale incumbencies, or is this because we have a problem of a large-scale incumbencies of customers, consumers in terms of large-scale power production companies, et cetera, and fuel-providing companies, that actually the incumbency is on the wrong end of the stick on this one, that you have monopsonistic situations here?
Yeah, well, that's 3 or 4 questions. Just a further footnote to your IBM observation. IBM was also a major recipient of R&D contracts in this molecular electronics program run by the Air Force that went nowhere. But I think entry, new firms, clearly an important theme in the IT story. And to the extent that federal policy encouraged that, I think it did have a very positive influence on both the performance of innovation and also cost reduction and the spread of applications. This may be an area where, certainly in some segments, energy faces much more significant barriers. I think there's certainly, if you move away from traditional energy sources in generation, clearly we're seeing more entry by non-incumbents in alternative sources like wind power and the like. Whether and how one will see entry in transportation fuels, transportation energy, again, it will probably come through competing technologies rather than entrants competing with the incumbents in petroleum refining and the like. But I think to the extent that federal policy in the energy space can tilt in favor of entry, clearly it seems to be a theme that spans a number of these different histories that we've talked about this morning.
David, thank you very much.
Thank you.